Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Olympic Handover here on France 24. I'm Delano de Souza. Officials in Tokyo are set to officially pass the baton over to Paris as it gears up to host the Games in 2024. The city has already hosted the Games in 1900 and 1924. Paris will become the second city in the world after London to host the Olympics 3 times. A giant flag is set to be unveiled from the Eiffel Tower, and the French Air Force will be doing a flyover. Now, over the next 30 minutes, we'll be discussing what's at stake and what challenges lie ahead as the city gears up for Paris 2024. I'm joined on set by France 24 sports editor James Vecina, and we'll be speaking to Jean-Luc Chapelet, professor of public management at Lausanne University. Good to have you with us here, sir, on France 24. Now, Japan has just hosted an Olympic Games in the middle of a pandemic without spectators. This clearly is a scenario Paris hopes will never happen for it.
This is a question?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, yes, it was a miracle in a way. A lot of people predicted that the games would not take place. They were postponed for 1 year. This is the first time it ever happened. But not this time. And in fact, they took place and quite well, I must say. Of course, there were no spectators, but the athletes were able to perform and to win medals. And I think on TV, there was not much difference between what happens normally. One thing maybe many people didn't notice is that there was a sound. There was a very interesting sound from the athletes' movements, which we do not hear in general because there is so much noise in the crowd, in the spectators.
That's an interesting perspective. James, I want to bring you in. You know, as the professor was telling us, that having a silent stadium made you actually listen to other things which you never heard from an athlete before.
Yeah, it did. I mean, I think where we felt that silence and that absence of fans the most was definitely in athletics. I mean, hearing that gun go off and no cheers after it, hearing no crowds at all, and obviously the athletes in such a big Olympic stadium, no one around them. We saw obviously records get broken, tears of emotion in athletes' eyes, but obviously that fans element isn't there. It's crucial, but it was surprising to actually, I mean, for us who were here watching it, obviously from the other side of the world, it was quite impressive to see that these games did go on. We were able to. It was once in a lifetime, hopefully, kind of games, but they did manage to put it off without the fans. And obviously this would be for Japan when they first postponed the games. It was with the idea that the pandemic wasn't going to be there. They kept the same name because the idea was that this is going to show, this is going to be the light, the flame, as they were saying, to show that we've managed to beat the pandemic. That wasn't the case. It was still happening. So, and Japan having to make adjustments until the very, very end. We saw that happen when it came to the fans. At first, it was a limited number of fans. Then it was no fans from outside of Japan. Then it was a few Japanese fans in a few stadiums. But they constantly had to adjust that, and it's pretty remarkable that they have managed to put it off with taking into consideration all the backlash that there was, of course, from the Japanese on the ground. The games which weren't popular, ahead of the games, 70 to 80% of the public said to be in Japan opposed or asking the games to either be postponed again or actually be cancelled. But nevertheless, it worked out, and for us watching it from this side, it was brilliant. And for Paris, of course it's a concern. But you would hope. We all hope that
we'll see at what stage of the pandemic we're at. And I'd like to go across to France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent, standing by at Trocadero as Paris prepares to receive the baton from Tokyo. Catherine, what's happening where you are?
Hi Delano, well you could probably hear there's a massive party going on down here at the Trocadero opposite the iconic Eiffel Tower for DJ sets, BMX demonstrations, and on stage behind me, in the middle of that crowd actually at the moment, the flags carried by France's medal-winning athletes who've already returned from Tokyo. A few more still yet to arrive, because obviously France had a final push for some gold medals there in collective sports right at the end of the games. But people here are really in celebratory mood, a real contrast actually with some of the scenes over the last 18 months during the pandemic. Now here, a day of celebration. Now, we were supposed to be having, during Paris's moment of glory in this opening ceremony, a huge flag the size of a football field flown off the Eiffel Tower, but unfortunately that's had to be cancelled because we've had some extremely windy and rainy weather here today. It's been a bit of a terrible summer in Paris, but they will be playing a replay of those images of the flag filmed back in June. That just shows how bad the weather has been recently. And there's going to be a flyover from the Patrouille de France, the French special planes with red, white and blue smoke over the Eiffel Tower. So hoping for some pretty iconic scenes at any time now here in Paris.
Fantastic. And Catherine, you know, you said Paris is getting ready to host these games in 3 years' time, but there are two scenarios they're preparing for.
Right, that's it. They very much got a plan A and a plan B. So plan A is if everything goes to plan and there's no more coronavirus, and it's pretty much a classic Olympics. So of course the organisers are hoping to give it very much of a French twist. Plan B, on the other hand, is the gloomy scenario of if, you know, we are still in the grips of some form of pandemic or international health crisis. So the Paris 2024 team had a whole team of officials shadowing their counterparts in Japan, seeing how those isolation bubbles, how the testing, how all the restrictions worked on social distancing, and of course they had no spectators at the games, sadly, there. So they've been planning for a worst case scenario as well as perhaps a smoother time, so it makes it all the more complicated. And of course they've only got 3 years to go because the Olympic cycle is shorter, because the 2020 games clearly were after in 2021, so that brings it only to 3 years until 2024.
We'll see what happens between now and then. Catherine, we'll come back to you a little later on. I'd like to go across to Professor Jean-Loup Chapelet, Professor of Public Management at Lausanne University. So, you know, the French think that they can host the Olympics with a budget of 7.5 billion euros because Paris has a lot of the infrastructure already in place. Do you think that's likely?
Well, I didn't hear very well the question, but clearly the budget is an issue, of course, and it has to be controlled as much as possible. I think Paris has taken the measures to control this budget, and also Paris is not constructing too many facilities, which is, of course, always a question of cost and investment and being ready on time and so on. So I think altogether the Paris budget looks feasible. And we'll see, because there is now an anti-Olympic movement going on, and you have to be very careful with what you're doing. And we saw that, of course, that this movement was very active before Tokyo, and for Paris, of course, it will be in place, not only in France, but all over the world.
Catherine, I'd like to bring you in once again because, you know, normally between Olympic Games we have 4 years. Of course, COVID-19 has pushed Tokyo 2020 back 1 year to 2021. Will the fact that we're going from Tokyo to Paris in 3 years' time rather than 4 change anything?
You know, it is going to be a push here. Obviously, Paris has been getting ready for these games ever since it won the bid back in 2017. So they haven't waited until this moment to organise. And the organisers say that 95% of the arenas and the infrastructure is in place because, of course, Paris is a capital city and it's got a great deal of sporting infrastructure already operational. So they've got that on their side. But, of course, there's a huge amount of organising to do and the timescale is tighter and things are more complicated because of coronavirus restrictions. They've lost a lot of time. You know, France went into lockdowns like many countries around the world, and that time, you know, people would have been working remotely on the organising committee. It was, in a sense, frustrating for them as well because it's lost time. And then, of course, they're planning for several different scenarios. So they're going to be working around the clock. Tony Estanguet, who's the head of Paris 2024, is adamant they will do it. And he says they're going to be exemplary games. He wants to make them also more inclusive, greener than any other games before. And he really wants to bring Paris into it. So things like getting beach volleyball played out here opposite the Eiffel Tower. He wants to have skateboarding at the Place de la Concorde and the equestrian events held in the grounds of the Chateau of Versailles. So really they want to make this the mark of these games. They want to make them spectacular as well as just achieving them. But there's no doubt that is an awful lot of work to go.
So they want to make it the postcard of Olympics, if you will. James Messina, I'd like to bring you in because, let's talk about the Olympics themselves, which have just completed over in Tokyo. France bagged 8 gold medals. The next host, Paris, will clearly have pressure to up their game.
Yeah, they will, because definitely, I mean, whilst they've ended up in that top 10, the France ending in 8th place, it's not any of the glory that you see higher up on that medals count. I think if we take a little look at the medals table that came in, of course, today as the events came to a close, there's a massive gap between some of the higher teams. When I'm thinking about obviously Team USA right up there, China, who's in so many different events, and then we've got Japan, the host nation, trickling down to Russia, to Great Britain. But after that, the last 3 or 4, they're all on the same gold counts, and this is something that France needs to diversify, because they've done well in some of their the events in which, of course, they excel in general, but they're pretty much absent in a lot of others. And we've been talking about it earlier on in our special coverage of the Olympics, and we were saying in athletics they're barely there. Swimming, same thing. If France wants to put on a show that's it intends to, in the way that's, because I mean France and Paris definitely they can put on just, I mean, a superb it's just going to look amazing. I mean, Catherine talking just there about volleyball in the Eiffel Tower, skateboarding, Place de la Concorde. It'll look amazing.
Events at Chateau Versailles. I mean, does it get better than that?
Does it get better? I mean, for France's image, to
you can come in last place. It looks great.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. I mean, as long as you're there, you got your picture taken, you're fine with it. But if France wants to kind of go in Japan's ways and try and finish in that top 3, it's going to have to diversify. It's going to be a challenge for it. Japan came out really well, finishing in that top 3. But again, this is something that France is going to have to work on. Going to have to do better in some of the new sports as well, because we didn't see definitely the results that we wanted to see over there. But of course, there's 3 years ahead of it. We've heard some of the strategies kind of coming across to try and diversify, bring in more athletes, of course, because the more athletes you field, the more chance you've got to take part in them. There'll be 10,500 athletes taking place, so hopefully France can grab a bigger place in there. We can hear the Marseillaise there ringing out, and definitely the image that France is going to want to send to the world with the Eiffel Tower, Marseillaise, and everything that's French, and I guess bringing this glamour to it, of course, taking place in Paris.
Indeed, and it's sort of formalizing that the handover is taking place. Now, French athletes who returned from Tokyo have been telling France 24 what the Olympics meant for them. Take a listen.
I am really proud today to have these gold medals. Like, I have 2 gold medals. I would never imagine something like that. And I will sleep with it.
It was a very beautiful experience. It was our first time Olympics. We were happy and being grateful to be there.
So we were just listening to French athletes who had returned home from the Olympic Games in Tokyo, speaking to France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent. Catherine, Paris says it wants to make the next Olympic Games greener. How does it plan to do this?
In terms of making the Olympic Games greener, they're trying to reuse a lot of the existing venues which are already in place here in Paris. They've also been on a push to try and vegetalise, as they call it here, to plant trees and flowers and things in the French capital and just get that kind of ecological footprint better over recent years. There's going to be special access, of course, for bikes and green forms of transport. They've really been pushing the public transport links as well. But it is a big push. They want to try and use reusable materials, of course. I mean, the Olympics does have an ecological carbon footprint. There's no getting away from that. It costs money and it does produce waste. But one of their targets is, of course, to make this greener than before. And that goes very much along with what the Mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, has been trying to do globally in office. She is in a coalition with the Socialist Party and the Green Party. So she's very much taking that environmentally friendly line. And that's been carried over into the 2024 Olympic organisation.
Catherine, thank you very much for that. We just heard there the French national anthem wrapping up. Professor Jean-Loup Chaplet, I wanted just to ask you, worst case scenario, what is it like for a host country to have to host the Olympics without foreign tourists, essentially, and spectators in the stadiums?
Well, of course, it's not very positive, and I think Japan expected many more tourists. They say at one point they wanted to have 30 million tourists, reach a 30 million tourists mark during this Olympics. Of course, it was not possible, although tourism is growing in Japan. But in Paris, which is already the largest touristic city in the world, it's of course a challenge, and I hope it will be possible. Tourists and so on. It's very important also for ticketing and for the revenues of the organization. Don't have.
It seems we have a special guest for the handover ceremony, French astronaut Thomas Pesquet. There you could see on your screens near the Eiffel Tower. I wonder if he's saying anything.
He's from way up in space.
France already pulling out all the Top Guns.
Yeah, everything. I mean, now to use a special guest from the ISS. It's going to be hard to get better than that.
James, you know, at Tokyo 2020, we saw karate that made its way into the games this year. Do we know what sort of sports are going to make their way into Paris for 2024?
We do. We know that climbing is going to stay. That's one to come. And that's,
that looked fun, quite honestly.
I think everyone enjoyed watching that, especially the sprints. I mean, it was great fun watching them.
Because there are a lot of people who do indoor rock climbing on a regular basis for fun, personally. So to see that in the Olympics,
it's become very popular, and I think that's going to make it even more popular. I mean, I know we hear about a lot of people who are definitely getting into the sports. So that's one of the new sports that's going to be allowed to stay, because of course every time that an Olympics is held, the host country gets to choose the five of those some of those sports sets to take place in as like special sports, extra sports part of it. Skateboarding will remain, as we mentioned, which is one where France is going to have to improve because they send quite a lot of skateboarders in there, but unable to come in without a medal. But of course, as we saw in the event, it was all the smiles, it was everything. Everything was new. So everything was done with a smile on the face, and it didn't really matter as you can see in there of the outcome. In a way, obviously for France it does, but participating and for skateboarding, for example, a sport which has so long been on the outside of all major sports and had its own competitions, but never within these kind of like international bodies. For it to make a debut and to continue means that it's worked, because these new sports have to, as the IOC states, appeal to a younger public. So it's all part of that kind of incentive. And of course, with that in mind, breakdancing making its debut. That's going to be there in Paris, and that's going to be one that's obviously we're going to be looking out for, because how new can you get that again in terms of sports?
And a fun one to watch.
And definitely fun to watch.
And music to listen to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Get both for the price of one.
Catherine, I'd like to go across to you now. I see a lot of stuff, a lot of movement is happening where you are. A promotional video is being shown, apparently, of Paris 2024.
Yeah, there's a mix here of live images from today with the crowd and the athletes and, the Eiffel Tower from today. And then a picture of a giant flag flown off the Eiffel Tower. Now, that was due to happen live here as part of the handover ceremony, but unfortunately, the organisers had to cancel that because of bad weather. There's been torrential rain, very strong winds this morning, and so they couldn't have the flag being unfurled live in front of the eyes of the world as they'd hoped. We saw some pictures filmed back in June because Paris has had such a terrible summer that they didn't have the conditions to film it today in the middle of August. So yet another hiccup for the organisers to overcome, but they're putting on a show here and keeping this crowd amused here in the Trocadero in front of the Eiffel Tower.
Everyone would have been drenched. I think this is pretty good for the outcome that we've had.
That is true, Catherine. I can sense you're not happy about Paris this summer, nor am I. I wanted to, earlier you spoke about iconic venues being used in the games in 2024. Can you talk us through if the Seine is going to play a role at all? We lost Catherine because of the connection. James, do you know if the Seine is going to be used at all in any of the swimming events? Because that was up in the air before.
There's going to be, there's still lots to say around it. And of course, we don't know whether, a lot of things will be decided and might be able to be moved as we get closer towards it. But obviously, there'll be some events taking place within Paris, some outside. To how far that's going to go, we'll have to see. But in terms of when it comes to sailing, of course, that's not something that's going to be able to be taking place on the Seine directly, but further out. So still plenty to define really for now. But yeah, we will definitely be keeping a close eye on that.
Professor Jean-Loup Chaplet in Lausanne, I just want to ask you, the Olympics, do citizens of cities still have that same sort of pride of hosting the Olympics as they did in the past, or has COVID changed any of that?
Well, certainly it has changed things in Japan, but I think in our cities there is still a lot of pride, and we'll see in Paris, but I don't doubt there will be very much enjoyment and pride to host the Olympics. There will be no event in the Seine water or Seine River, as far as I know, but there will be events in Tahiti. So it's will be a fun way to see the whole of France, not only Paris, to this Olympic Games.
Okay, you just saw the French Air Force completing the flyover of the French flag. There you can see the red, white, and blue. Okay, so
if I may add something.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, this idea of using iconic venues like the Champs-Élysées, the Place de la Concorde, the Eiffel Tower, the Invalides, and so on, was first introduced by London, 2012, with Buckingham Palace, Lords, and other places which are iconic in London. And so, of course, Paris has many such iconic places, and that will be a wonderful background to the Games.
Indeed. It'll be interesting to watch. Now, in a break with previous games, Paris is hoping to repurpose many venues to keep costs and carbon emissions low. Fraser Jackson has a story.
From a beach volleyball court in front of the Eiffel Tower to an archery range on the Esplanade des Invalides, this is the Paris of the 2024 Olympic Games. A greener, more modern city ready to welcome the Olympic flame and the millions of fans following it. In Saint-Denis, just north of Paris, work has already begun on the Athletes' Village. During the Games, this apartment compound will hold over 14,000 people.
Le chantier des bâtiments a démarré aujourd'hui. Vous voyez en ce moment le démarrage des sous-sols.
The pandemic has already caused construction to be delayed by several months, but the pace is picking up as they turn this old power station complex into modern apartments ready to be sold to the public after the Games. The only new sites being built for 2024 are the Athletes' Village, the Aquatic Centre, the Media Village, a climbing wall, and this arena being built in the north of the city. All other sites will use temporary structures or existing buildings, such as the Palace of Versailles for horse riding or the Grand Palais for fencing. The recycling of venues was one of the key highlights of Paris's Olympic bid.
C'est des jeux spectaculaires, mais c'est aussi un nouveau modèle de jeu qui s'appuie sur de l'existant à 95% d'infrastructures qui sont déjà là, ce qui nous permet de réduire de moitié les émissions carbone.
A reduction in CO2 and in budget. Paris is estimating the Games will cost €7 billion, around a quarter the cost of the Tokyo Olympics, although the end costs are frequently higher than expected. Ahead of the 2024 Games, a football field-sized flag has been attached to the Eiffel Tower. It will be revealed during the handover exchange during the Tokyo 2020 closing ceremony.
James, we've spoken about how gender and diversity, have been at the Games in 2020 in Tokyo. Is Paris set to continue that in 2024?
Yeah, definitely. We've had, in terms of gender and mixed gender and diversity, we've spoken about it a lot, as you say, and this time, the IOC has actually announced that we actually are going to have a 50-50 share between male and female athletes for the first time ever in Paris. That's a big, big stretch from back when they last hosted the Games, of course. At the beginning, there were only in a couple of dozen women actually taking part. So a massive, massive difference. There's also a number of events that have been scrapped and then turned into either mixed events. That's the case, for example, for the 50-kilometre race walk. The one held in Tokyo will be the last one for the men's. There is a 20-kilometre one for the women's, but the 50-kilometre one for the men's will be scrapped. It's going to be replaced with a mixed gender event. We don't know quite yet. But there was issues with that, of course, because those taking part in it for them, an absolute heartbreak. It's not going to be the event which they've taken part in for so long. We've also seen that in sailing, the 470 event, that's going to now be mixed, which before was men's on one side, women on the other. And I think, as we were talking about just earlier on, the whole enthusiasm on in women's teams and just women's side of the Olympics has really taken off compared to other years. We've spoken, of course, much more. There's been much more excitement and there's been a lot to see, especially when we talked about the athletics in the 100, the 200 meters, which almost in a way outshone or maybe did outshine actually the men's side with the double, of course, for Elaine Thompson-Herah and Alison Felix becoming the most decorated athlete in her fields of all time. So huge amounts of discussion, and clearly we've seen progress on that side. Laura Hubbard, the first transgender athlete to compete, of course not going as far as she was expected to, but that came with a huge amount of backlash ahead of the Games, but in the end, she has, even though she didn't really want to, because she is someone who kind of avoids the spotlight in a way, made history this time. So it's definitely the pace it's going to continue in that way. It's not going to go further from that. And as we've seen this from the IOC and from what Paris wants to do, this is definitely set to continue.
It's amazing how the Olympic Games and a win gives a country so much pride. James, thank you very much for that. James Messina there. I'd like to thank Professor Jean-Louis Chapelet for joining us from Lausanne. That's it for this edition. Thank you very much for watching.